What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. It is my thrill and my delight to review episode 4 of season 2 of House of the Dragon, directed by Alan Taylor, a guy who's been making great TV for a long time. His career as a filmmaker has been a little more spotty, but when it comes to directing episodes of Game of Thrones and now House of the Dragon, he seriously delivers, because I think this is one of the best episodes of both seasons. Definitely the best episode of this season. And when people wonder, like, why do we read this shit? Why do we watch this shit? Why do we love this shit? It's because of episodes like this. Also, I should give a shout out to my little sister's friend Celeste, who is a massive fan of the show. But back during their graduation, I guess like a month or so ago, she and I were talking about the show, and she said that her favorite character was Rhaenys. And I didn't have the heart to tell her the fate that Rhaenys might encounter depending upon how the book was adapted. And so I let it kind of linger. But for people who love that character, have looked up to that character, who love the queen that never was, I hope they'll find her heroic final battle to be a satisfying one, even if it's bittersweet to have a character that you love meet their end, to go out in such glorious fashion. I feel like sometimes it's worse sometimes for a show to mishandle a character or write them poorly and that sort of thing. But in this case, they more or less adapted the scene from Rook's Rest verbatim. They added a few little additional twists and turns, which I'll get to in a bit, but obviously, I should have said at the outset, spoiler warning, etc. and so forth. If you've not seen the episode, go do so. But where should we start? Fuck it. We're just going to start with the end, because as much as I like the episode, it's the battle at Rook's Rest, which is most interesting. And we see how Cole, while he's not necessarily as crafty a hand as Otto Hightower, in his own way, he can be effective, because he and Aemond have been kind of plotting and scheming behind the scenes for a while. And he had a very clever trap ready to rock. And in the novel, both Aemond and Aegon rise up at the same time. I mean, here's the exact text from the book, where it says, Criston Cole had sprung his trap, and Rhaenys had come snatching at the bait. Now the teeth closed round her. Princess Rhaenys made no attempt to flee. With a glad cry and a crack of her whip, she turned Meleys toward the foe. And so it's like this big heroic moment where she realizes, oh shit, I'm fighting two dragons. Like one-on-one, she probably could have beaten or had a good chance of beating either of them, but obviously against both Sunfire and Vhagar, there's not a dragon alive that's gonna win that fight. And obviously with the additional wrinkle that they added to this show, where Aemon's not necessarily that concerned with his brother's welfare. I mean, that was definitely something new added to the show, where we see just how increasingly Aemond has nothing but contempt for Aegon. And I'm jumping around a bit, I apologize, but it's because I enjoyed it. But one of my favorite scenes was during the small council meeting, when Aemond is speaking in Old Valyrian to his brother, and you can tell Aegon paid less close attention during his lessons, and he kind of talks in baby talk and can't quite keep up. And we see Aemond talking all kinds of trash about Aegon's poor decisions, like raising some of his drinking buddies to the status of Kingsguard and that sort of thing. So Aemond clearly was not afraid to blast both of his opponents, and we saw Sunfire and Aegon go crashing to the ground. And then we got a proper dogfight, at least a dogfight if they could breathe fire. And one of my favorite details in the show that was not from the book, or at least I don't remember a scene like this from the book, but I think it's when Sunfire is having its belly raked open by Meleys, and that hot, like molten lava blood is dropping down on the men below, and you can hear them screaming as like the smoking blood lands on them, almost like it's like boiling oil. I thought that was a really cool detail, because it's one thing to describe dragons dancing and fighting on the page. It's much more complex and much more expensive to put it on the screen. Like, you can write in a sentence like, the two dragons danced and wheeled about and one finally fell. But to do that on a show, I mean, you're talking about millions and millions of dollars, or, at least hundreds of thousands of dollars and special effects. And I thought, on the whole, the dragons look pretty goddamn cool. And there are great little details along the way. Like at one point, I think it's Sunfire bites off one of the horns of Meleys. So at least Sunfire got a few licks in. I guess one of my only criticisms would be that Sunfire wasn't nearly as beautiful and gorgeous as I'd been led to believe. Like in the text of the book, Fire and Blood, Sunfire is always described as the most beautiful dragon that's ever lived, where it's like almost like a molten gold that's smooth without scale, where it's like people cannot believe just how gorgeous and just how beautiful Sunfire is to look upon. Obviously, after battling with Meleys, less so now. But I liked how the battle wasn't all just fire and blood and murder and mayhem. There was a little sadness there, and I was reminded a little bit of some of the dogs that I've been affectionate toward throughout my life. When we see Maylis, after being bitten on the neck and kind of turning, I'm going to start crying here. I'm not crying, you're crying. When he turns to Rhaenys, and she realizes, her old companion is finally about to meet its end, and they just fall out of the sky as opposed to like crashing down. And of course, when they fall, they land on Rook's Rest, allowing the army to continue their siege. But at least now we know just how gnarly it is when dragons battle dragons, and just how awful it is when Targaryens fight Targaryens. Because while it's all well and good for Targaryens to fly to fire and glory and that sort of thing, and maybe one or two of them won't quite make it. I mean, of the people on the battlefield, Aegon's fate is in question. If you want to know what happens to Aegon, read the book. But there is a tease or a line in the teaser which suggests that his fate is at least up in the air, and that's all I'll say on that front. And obviously, Rhaenys is gone for good. So while 2 Targaryens sadly met their end, but how many hundreds of men died screaming down below? Like, we see Cole at one point after he wakes up from being unconscious, tapping somebody on the shoulder, like, we gotta go check on the king, and it's nothing but bones inside. And we see all these guys stumbling around with just horrible burns, almost like a nuclear wasteland. And George R. R. Martin on many occasions has described this world where dragons are the nuclear option for this world. And we see just how much what it truly means, but by their catchphrase, fire and blood. So I'm going to force myself to stop talking about this battle, because I know inevitably I'm going to end up giving away spoilers about Sunfire and Vhagar and Maylis and all their riders and that sort of thing. But I'll just say that of all the big scenes that I wanted to see adapted by the show this season, this scene was the most satisfying for me so far. Like, I was disappointed by the murder of Jaehaerys in episode 1, and I was really disappointed by that final scene in episode 3, which was made up for the show. But at least I got a little bit of payback when the character Jace is calling his mother, basically calling her out, like, what the fuck were you doing? Where have you been? Why were you in King's Landing, etc. and so forth. I was like, yes, you are expressing my point of view as well, because that scene should have never been in the show. It was idiotic. Rhaenyra should have never done something as risky and self-destructive as that. But I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm more than happy to put up with some bad scenes or some bad characterizations or some bad episodes if and when the show gets to the scenes that I like from the book and does them well. And as I've said before, I thought the killing of Jaehaerys, a son for a son, was pretty weak, and they kind of tapped the brakes. But when it came to the battle at Rook's Rest, they held nothing back, and so it would not surprise me at all if this becomes one of those episodes that people look back on very fondly in the history of all these TV shows adapting George R. R. Martin's material. And I must admit that so far throughout Season 2, I've been pretty disappointed by the characterization of both Daemon as well as Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra keeps saying, well, just because I'm hesitant doesn't mean I'm weak. It's like, fine, she's starting to show her strength now. And now that Rhaenys has been killed, I'm sure she will, double down and put her foot on the gas pedal. But we've basically had half the season go by with Rhaenyra being largely ineffective. And Daemon, who's my favorite character in the show, he spends all of his time having all these weird dreams in Harrenhal. And what they've basically done with this show is they're postponing or delaying when he sends a raven to Dragonstone, letting them know that he has taken Harrenhal and that he's trying to gather an army of Blackwoods. I keep getting the Blackwoods and their rivals confused, as do a lot of people. And so he's summoning the Blackwoods, which have declared for Team Black. But I just find it hysterical how the Tullys are considered kind of weak overlords, because Grover Tully, who's the patriarch of the family, he's old and sick, and his grandson, Oscar, is basically waiting for his grandfather to die before making any decisions, and he's of no use to Daemon if he's unable or unwilling to put a pillow over his grandfather's face and start making some decisions. But I think we'll see Daemon starting to raise some armies and doing some cool shit. But in the book, Daemon is like, he's just hell on wheels. He's always kicking ass. He's always doing evil things, but great things. And I just feel like this season's been kind of holding him back. But at least Aemond has been depicted as the true Targaryen that he is. And what I really like about this episode is how there are now enough fresh grievances where even if Rhaenyra and Alicent and like cooler heads were to prevail and they were to try to stop the war altogether, there's way too much fresh blood being spilt and way too many new fresh atrocities and fresh horrors that people have experienced, where even if Rhaenyra and Alicent and the Greens and the Blacks were to try to settle their differences, there would still have to be many more battles to be fought before people would kind of calm down and call it quits and that sort of thing. So the war has begun in earnest. We've basically been waiting for 14 episodes for the war to really begin. You could say maybe it really ended in the season 1 finale, but now battles with dragons and Targaryens falling out of the sky. Now it's a proper dance of the dragons, or the dying of the dragons, as George R. R. Martin describes it. But as exciting as the final battle was, there are a few other scenes that are worth mentioning. We're starting to get more material with the character of Alice Rivers, and I believe Rivers is the name for bastard children who grew up in the Riverlands, kind of like how Jon Snow, like all bastards in the North have the last name Snow. I believe all bastards in the Riverlands have the last name Rivers, but Alice Rivers, some might call her a maester, some might call her a witch, but we see how either Harrenhal, just due to being cursed, is having an impact on Daemon, and he's having weird dreams about beheading the young Rhaenyra and that sort of thing. But we see that there's a growing relationship between Daemon and Alice. I could spoil where that relationship's going, but I won't, because I think it will provide some interesting twists and turns throughout the rest of this season, as well as the seasons to come. And I really enjoyed seeing how Cole is becoming a full-blown leader of men, how his army's continuing to swell. Like, he gets an early victory at Duskendale, and he basically says, anyone who refuses to bend the knee, I'm going to behead you, like, here and now. And so, but some people choose to be beheaded. But Duskendale, if you look at this map right here, you can see how Duskendale is on the way to Rook's Rest, not on the way to Harrenhal. But it makes sense how he was kind of sneaking along the coast, picking off some easy victories or some low-hanging fruit, because with each fresh victory, he brings more people to their cause, more people to their side. And I like that little face-off between him and Gwaine, the brother of Alicent, where Gwaine's like, well, that's suicide, that is stupid, the dragon's all around, like, we can't attack during the day. But Cole has a plan, and part of that plan is using his men, spreading them out and dividing them, luring a dragon in to take the bait and attack, so that we can, when it's time for Vhagar, who's asleep out in the woods, covered in camouflage. I love those shots of Vhagar, and how when it's time to wake up, and when Aemon sees his brother flying in, he's like, all right, well, chill, let's wait a second. And Vhagar, like an old dog who's got like aches and pains, just like, kind of collapses back down. Like, Vhagar reminds me of my mom's old golden retriever, Henry, who toward the end of his days would kind of groan as he got up and got down. But my favorite moment with Vhagar is when he finally enters the battle and he's flying along the tree line. It's like Jaws, like seeing the fin coming out of the water, but you can just see a little hint of Vhagar flying along. Like, oh my God, like, it's scary seeing Meleys and Sunfire battle, but Vhagar's just so much bigger. He's slower and a little less maneuverable, but when he gets his talons into you, or his fucking teeth, or his fire, you really can't fuck with Vhagar. Because one interesting thing about dragon lore and George R. R. Martin, that the older and larger a dragon gets, the hotter their fire becomes. So yeah, when Vhagar lets loose his flame, yeah, nothing can stand in his path. But I do enjoy these little maps showing all the different angles from where the soldiers are coming from, like where you can see Dragonstone and its relationship to King's Landing versus Harrenhal, and where Rook's Rest is. And so most of the war so far has been confined to this little region. I think they call it the Kinglands, but anyway, all the areas around King's Landing. But slowly but surely, as the Hightowers get into things, and as the Baratheons join forces, and as the Martells and the Tyrells, and all these other families, and the Starks of Winterfell, and that sort of, like, as all these other families start kind of moving in, the war just continues to build and grow and grow and get more interesting. But another scene I found interesting was the ongoing debate or dispute in Rhaenyra's small council, because Rhaenyra's been gone doing that stupid mission to King's Landing that was cooked up by the writers of the show. I know some people liked it, and like, that was such a blunder in so many ways, but whatever, we'll forgive them because this episode was so strong. But we see how Jace and Baela and Rhaenys are basically trying to maintain order while all these other kind of power-hungry and ambitious men are, fighting for getting their way, fighting the war in their fashion, so on and so forth. And when Rhaenyra finally returns, I like seeing Jace. He's finally becoming a man. Obviously, he's got a little older since season 1, but he's like, what the hell? Like, where have you been? What are your goals? Blah, blah, blah. And she finally takes him into her confidence and explains to him the Song of Ice and Fire, which, as I've said before, and I'll say again, there's not one single reference to a Song of Ice and Fire throughout the entire book, Fire and Blood. This is something they've introduced in the show to connect it to Game of Thrones. I get why they're doing it for the sake of HBO and branding, but it really has no bearing on this war. This war is all about who's going to be on the Iron Throne when the dust has finally settled. And Alicent had some really interesting scenes this episode as well. I think of all the Greens, I find her the most sympathetic, but she's still pretty ruthless and willing to give her son Aegon some tough love. But we see her drinking some of that tea to get rid of some unwanted consequences from all the shagging she's been doing with Cole. But I love how Aegon basically comes like crying to mommy, but like, no one listens to me on the small council. She's like, yeah, well, everybody on the small council has earned their position there. And some might argue the which Lannister is on the small council. I get him and his twin brother confused. Some might argue he didn't necessarily earn his position there, but the point is well taken. Aegon should listen. He should shut up, listen, and learn, as old people like to say to young people, and like take their wisdom, digest it, and then when your time comes, you get to have your way. But I like how she's kind of putting him in his place, and he's like, "Watch your tone, mama." And she's like, "What are you gonna do? Like, you're gonna like hang me from the wall like a rat catcher?" I just like seeing how Alicent's more than happy to kind of throw her weight around. But the unintended consequence of giving her son some tough love is that he's like, you know what? It's time for me to prove myself. So he armors up, flies off to war, in a decision that he will come to regret. And one of the key moments in the war that will change the trajectory for how the Greens conduct themselves moving forward. But one last question I want to ask about that final scene as Cole is approaching Sunfire, who's groaning in agony on the ground. I mean, Sunfire got like one wing nearly torn off. It's like his belly torn open. Sunfire got burned. Sunfire's all fucked up. We're not quite sure what state Aegon is in, but as Cole's approaching, we see Aemon drawing his own sword. And it's like, well, what are you planning on using that for? Like, are you planning on putting Sunfire out of its misery? Are you planning on putting your brother out of your misery? Like, what were you about to do before Cole called out? And I love he sheaths the blade and then picks up the knife that Aegon has inherited from his father Viserys. But I thought that was an interesting moment where, if anything, this show is perhaps showing Aemon to be a little bit more ambitious and a little bit more diabolical than even in the book. Because in the book, while he acknowledges, like, I'm the better swordsman, I have the largest dragon, I'm obsessed with history and strategy, like, he's been grooming himself to lead for a long time, while his brother has been more of a kind of an alcoholic and a womanizer and a clown and that sort of thing. But I like how this show really lets Aemon lean all the way into his ambition and his baser instincts, meaning that if and when Aemon and Daemon finally meet each other up in the sky, it's going to be all the more interesting. So all in all, I'm a very satisfied fan. I think this show is finally delivering the dividends or the payoffs that the fans have been wanting and craving ever since this show started 2 years ago, because you can only build things for so much before you finally got to get down to the main event. I think for those people who've been waiting patiently, they'll be thrilled. And for some people who've been waiting for an excuse to start binging, now's the time to start binging, because if you don't start binging, you're going to have people spoiling the shit out of things and ruining the show for you and that sort of thing. So I think there'll be enough conversation and debate surrounding the show that it wouldn't surprise me if the show starts to pick up in viewership, because this season 2 has been kind of sort of struggling a little bit for HBO, at least struggling relative to the numbers that HBO would like to see this show generate. But I think now with this massive payoff, like, a lot of fans have had a chance to eat their dessert, and now it's time to start speculating and theorizing about what we might see in the next 4 episodes, because the teaser for episode 5 looked pretty goddamn good. But I think that's all I've got to say for now, so thank you so much for listening to my little rant about this episode. I greatly appreciate it. If you liked the video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has an amazing week, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.